It's fine. Fine.
Start. Okay, welcome to 42, Two Souls, One Journey, a raw and unedited look into our lives as humans. Based on the 21 grams experiment by Dr. Duncan MacDougall, who concluded that the human soul weighs 21 grams. On this video cast, we will explore that no matter what our lives look like on paper, our souls journey similarly. Hey, on this episode, we are speaking with one of Winnipeg's best welcoming committee, the current reigning Miss Club 200, an executive director at Sunshine House. They're creative, they're magical, they're loving, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say they're Winnipeg's iconic community builder. Levi La Foy, or Miss Prairie Sky if you're nasty. Hello, how are you?
Good morning. I am fine. How are you?
I am super excited and pumped. I feel like I've been waiting for this moment, and my soul's been like, oh my God, I want to know everything. And I have like 100 questions, but I'm going to try to keep it to the top three because the conversation always goes longer than we need to.
We'll see how verbose I get.
Yeah, get as verbose as you want to. This is an opportunity for people out there to get to know you via you as a Winnipeg icon. For me. Yeah.
Okay.
No pressure, none.
All right then.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for that amazing welcoming message you sent Raheem and I as Prairie Sky via our friend Agatha, who is, I have to say, the kindest, nicest human on earth. Like,
Oh yeah.
you can't even debate it. I feel like Mother Teresa, like, if there was an
Mother
equivalent,
Teresa was actually kind of awful, wasn't she?
that's what I've heard. And the more I researched about her, the more I learned about like the shadiness about Mother Teresa. And I feel like if Mother Teresa was a white woman in Winnipeg, it'd be Agatha. Like all the niceness, all the nice stuff of Mother Teresa.
All the nice, like, yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
That aura.
So I feel like I need to start off with your article in Canadian Art. What are, because I feel like that just encompasses community for me, right? And I also have a few ignorant questions that need clarification, I guess.
Great.
Can we start with that? Right.
Great.
So you were in Canadian Art as Prairie Sky talking about Bandock Babes.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think their introduction that they did was like such a beautiful way. So I'll read it out so that way I'm not making stuff up. So the birth of the Bandock Babes and drag community. 5 members of Winnipeg-based drag collective Bandock Babes will chat about the say that again? Bannock? Bannock.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bannock Babes have a chat on significant building community on the prairies and reveal the power behind two-spirited indie queer performance. So indie queer, where, let's start with that. What does that mean and where does that come from for you?
So indigiqueer is a phrase. It's not a phrase that I necessarily identify with, but it's a phrase that a lot of younger folks identify with. Mostly because it's a political term, obviously, because it combines the phrase indigenous and the word indigenous and that kind of all of those definitions and all of those nuances and all of the strings that come attached to that word and the word queer and all of the things that kind of come with that and bring it together. It's a relatively newer phrase. The origins, of course, are who knows, the internet, Tumblr. I don't know where people started using it, but it's a word that a lot of folks have latched onto, and I think a lot of folks have latched onto it because Two-Spirit isn't necessarily a phrase that everyone identifies with, that everyone who's Indigenous identifies with. Again, a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. So I usually identify as Two-Spirit depending on the context. Sometimes I'll identify as queer, sometimes I'll identify as gay, or sometimes I'll just identify as not identifying as anything and just let people figure it out themselves. But for me, like when I came out and when I was navigating this stuff, Two-Spirit was the concept that my relations in my community could understand and could figure out. Just 1 second. I'm sorry. We're waiting for our super sexy Sunshine House calendars, and so I'm not sure if the phone ringing is them or if it's just somebody just calling. So
Do you need to pick
I
it
hope
up?
they'll just. No, I'll just wait and we'll just see what happens.
Okay, sounds good.
They can ring the doorbell and then I'll have to pause and run downstairs and get it.
Perfect. Oh my God, we got to get our first pause on the podcast. That's amazing. This is what the exciting part of being raw and unedited is.
Oh yeah, because I guess you don't edit. Yeah, shit. Sorry.
No, I don't have the skill, so I just play as a. So for someone who doesn't understand, so can we break that down then? So two-spirited. What is that for the folks out there who, and I'm going to be those folks who don't understand what that means. How does somebody identify as, what are the, I'm going to box it in, I guess that's the only way I can understand is, what are the categories that are needed to be to identify as two-spirited, and then what are the boxes that we need to check off to identify as in indigiqueer? Like, what would be the differences there?
Okay, so let's step back to, we're using concepts that don't fit nicely into Indigenous frames of reference or Indigenous understandings of gender and sexuality. So all of these things are going to be a lot unnecessarily messy because we're not using linguistic or social concepts that we would use 75 years ago, when much more of us were speaking our language and much more of us had access to culture and community in a different way. Okay. 150 years ago, 75 years ago, you would already see the impacts because residential school was just such a massive force on communities, and particularly for queer members of those communities. So two-spirit and indigiqueer, first off, two-spirit is a phrase that was coined just north of here by a bunch of great, fantastic people. And it came in a dream to the elder Myra Laramie, who's still around and who's still active in the community. And she's a hero of mine. She's just beautiful. And if you ever get to meet her, she is an icon beyond belief. And she's so hilarious. So the two-spirit came to her in a dream at a gathering, and I think it was 1989 at the two-spirit gathering, maybe 1991. And it gained a lot of traction because many of the folks who attended that gathering, that was organized by many of the people who are still part of Two-Spirit people of Manitoba today, like Albert McLeod. There's some other folks that were there. I believe Gail Pruden was there, and maybe Kelly Houle and some other folks. I'm not sure though, because I wasn't there. I'm younger than them. But anyway, so that's my understanding of that. And so it gained a lot of traction because the words that were being used at that time to describe people of gender and sexual variance in these communities and academic circles, or even in like the public sphere, were way more offensive and often didn't fit, right? Because let's think in my context. In the context of the Anishinaabe people of like Southern Treaty 3, so the area that I come from, right on the border of Ontario and Minnesota, we would have 6 or 7. There's 6 different terms that describe people's sexual activities. That doesn't necessarily mean that it describes their sexual identities. And then there's at least 2 to 3 terms outside of man and woman that describe people's gender identities. And so you have all of these different types of identities to explain, all of these different words to help explain people's behaviors, people's social categories, which is super important in a collective environment. And it also will explain people's those words would also help explain people's relationality to each other within a community setting. So two-spirit, so coming back to this, two-spirit isn't necessarily a word that it's not the word that contemporary speakers use, isn't actually, it is a literal translation of an English phrase of two-spirit, but whereas there's other words that would be used. However, many people gravitated to that because it was better. It was a much better concept to describe and to kind of create a collective collective sense. We also got to think of in context of general social movements that were happening in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and even continuing today, where particularly for Indigenous communities in North America, and in Canada, when we were allowed to be a lot more mobile and we were allowed to move into cities and we were allowed to move into urban spaces without having serious legal ramifications on us as Indigenous people, there's a lot more pan-Indianism that's happening. So a lot more collective identity that's being formed around people piecing together remnants of Indigenous identities because of the extreme loss that was faced through colonization, through death and disease, and then through residential schools. And then linguistic loss, that was all part of that. So you had human loss, you had linguistic loss, and you had cultural loss as kind of the ultimate loss. And then of course, disconnect from land and territory. So Two-Spirit is for me, it's a political term that connects me to that kind of, that history, that kind of emerging from, like the phoenixes emerging from the ashes of this really intense, not hidden, forceful, violent colonization that occurred in Canada and to people. So for me, it's always been a political term and not so much a cultural term. However, that being said, when there was more and more queer Indigenous people who were doing this type of activism, and again, a lot of that stemmed from places where Indigenous people had started to congregate and create community in urban environments like Winnipeg, there was a lot more attention being paid to it. So then people like my grandma and my grandpa and my uncles who didn't maybe have access to kind of that, who didn't have access anymore to traditional stories because older ones had been gone, had died, or people just weren't talking about it for fear of repercussions. And so when Two-Spirit started getting traction in those circles, that was a thing that people latched onto, even though it wasn't necessarily a linguistic and cultural concept that was Indigenous to us. So when I came out in the early 2000s to my grandma, the late 90s, early 2000s, like right at Y2K, I came out. So that was a thing she could understand because she was attending conferences as an elder. She was traveling a little bit more as an invited speaker to different things in Minneapolis and Thunder Bay and Toronto and Winnipeg. She would encounter activists, like Two-Spirit activists, and so she would talk to them, and she learned all of these things going through the 90s. And then my great grandpa had a lot of stories too, but she wouldn't remember those stories until something was triggered. And so then when she would talk to other queer people and they would talk about different things, she would remember things, and then she would share those things with me. And so Two-Spirit was a real avenue for me to connect to my granny, of course, who I always had a really close relationship, but also it would connect me back to that community because that was always a place that I felt safe. That's not to say that Couchiching has always been a safe place for all queer people. That was my very limited experience oftentimes as a visitor to the community. Yeah, so that's kind of what Two-Spirit means. So that's a really long roundabout way of saying that a while ago, it was one of the only things that we had. It was one of the only terms that we had that looked comfortable, because identifying as gay or lesbian maybe didn't sit well with people, or identifying as trans maybe didn't sit well with people. Whereas this term Two-Spirit connotates a very important and significant movement in a larger pan-Indian movement, but it also signifies loss of culture, but on the flip side, a resurgence or a rejuvenation in trying to reacquire what you might have lost. And so for a lot of people, that's why we gravitated towards it. Now, as things change and words change and meanings change all the time, when Dr. Alex Wilson, actually, if you're not familiar with her, she's also really amazing. She's queer. She's from OCN and she works at the University of Saskatoon. Her and I were having a conversation one time. We were just in a social environment. She said, yeah, like I remember when we were coming out, or around that time when both of us might have come out, Two-Spirit was like a sexuality term, whereas now it's more of a gender identity. And I reflected on that, and that's really, and I see that that's really true. So I think maybe there's some belief around, maybe indigiqueer kind of emerged out of this this need to kind of allow for Two-Spirit to kind of become more of a gender identity based term, whereas indigiqueer is kind of another term that where you're kind of in this kind of wonderful web of sexual and gender identities that maybe doesn't fit. I've also heard a lot of folks who use indigiqueer say they prefer indigiqueer because it is because they've never had any access to culture and they've never had any access to community and they don't have those same types of connections. So they can use indigiqueer as a term to allow them to connect to a new community, a community that's kind of emerging, a futuristic community, a community where there's not any kind of, maybe there's no kind of old guard keeping things, no traditions, where things can just be a little bit more fluid and fluctuate, and a lot more, not to say that any of that really exists within the Two-Spirit community, but it also is just like, that might be part of the appeal. I don't know. Like I said at the beginning, it's not a term that I necessarily identify with, but I do know that members of our collective prefer to use the word indigiqueer as opposed to Two-Spirit. So when we talk about it as a group, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that that's part of people's identities. Wow, that was really long. I'm sorry.
No, but so informative. I feel like in there you dropped names that are so important. You dropped this idea of relationships. You, like like colonization. I feel like there's so much that's happened within the indigenous community that we don't get a chance to talk about. That is so real. I'm not gonna use the word painful, but it's so ingrained into Canada and the world, and what's happening with us as souls, as humans, and that clearly we'll have to unpack at a completely different podcast. But what sticks out most for me is that this idea that as the world changes, as we change as people, as humans, this terminology has to change. It has to keep up with what's coming, or what is. We have to evolve with it. As humans, I feel like boxing in is a big thing for all of us. Like the only way we've been taught to understand things are in these very simple categories. Those don't exist anymore, right? Those people are challenging them. People are like, yeah, there's parts of this, but it's also this bigger part that none of us understand. And I think you and the Bannock Babes are gonna be like, the birth of them is the birth of this new experience of it, this new you're going to be able to explore and create in a collective, which is magical, to be honest with you.
It is.
Yeah.
And I think magic is, I like the term magic because it's relatable, but it also is like fun and it's playful, and it can be serious, and it can be juvenile, it can be whatever. And I think that's part of what the Bannock Babes is, because we all existed and we all knew about each other, and we all performed together weekly, and we work, like Vita, Feather, and I, we work together. Feather and I live together. So like, if you didn't know any different, you would think that we would hate each other, or that it would be messy and gross, but it's really not. It's like, this is probably one of the, outside of my family, this is one of, like, my birth family, this is one of the best living situations I've ever been in. But I think what really really happened, I think, with all kinds of, I don't know, I'm not a physicist and I'm not a metaphysicist, but when you have types of energies that are floating around and when you can kind of bring them together and kind of try to not harness it, but redirect it momentarily even for something, it's really quite powerful. I am going to do your pause now. Hold on.
All right. So I'm going to assume at this point, I'm going to cut out this piece. We're just going to keep going and see what happens. Can I pause the recording? Up, unpause. So we paused everything and let's see what that does. 2021, new learnings. Let's go for it. So.
Great. So yeah, but I think that's what a Bannock Babe show is magic. And it's anytime we get to collectively get together, even if it's just a few of us, you know it's something special. Because we also, prior to that, we never, even though we were performing together in the bar, we were never actually, you never really got those moments where you were in an entirely Indigenous space,
Right.
which is key. You don't need to live like that all the time. I'm not saying that, I'm not a segregationist, but you do need moments, especially in such a diverse community, where you need moments where you can pause and where you can get together just as kind of a collective unit and just be unapologetically Indigenous together and talk about those things together and what that means. So that's also really key to anytime we get together.
Oh no, I love that you said that. I feel it's something as I get older, this idea that stop apologizing about not being who I am or wanting to claim space that is, for me, it's like strictly South Asian, queer, Muslim spaces where like, let's get all of us together and talk about these things because, you know, there's moments where we could use a word that only we can understand. And fuck it if you don't get it. Like and it's just, this is so Canadian of me, but I'm something like, oh, just fuck it. I don't care if you don't get it. Like, it's okay for me to be it's okay for me to be in a space where I can be me or the rude me.
Yeah, right.
Because it just allows, it allows something in, it allows a creativity, it allows some space. It's like you said, it's this magical bonding, or there's a moment where you're like, oh, we are seeing the world in a very specific way because we've been allowed to see it in a very specific way, and it's okay for that. So yeah.
Well, and the other thing is like, when you're in your own space, you also can collectively let your guard down.
Yes.
Right. You don't, and it's not like when we're in Club 200 that we're always in defense or like in defense mode, but you know that there's no like kind of outsider eyes or outsider ears. You're not gonna have to explain jokes like you said, or
yes.
And then that's when you can also just like be really, really just pointed and honest and direct about whatever you're feeling and whatever you're going through. So when we were in Ottawa and we were in our Airbnb, like for me, like the whole Sinabka festival that we were a part of was so cool, but the actual moments that I'm going to take with me for the rest of my life are those moments that we were just the four of us in that kind of space in our Airbnb, getting ready, shooting the shit, just being ridiculous. Those are the moments, right? That's the defining moments to that.
Right. It's so interesting. I feel like people, you know, as a performer, people are always like, oh, the end stage is a result. Like, yes, that is a result of all the work, but it's the magic and all the fun relationship building happens backstage where you're putting makeup on or you're making those mistakes. Or where one of your sister farts in the middle of and that's the moment you cherish and remember for life.
Yeah.
But the world gets to see this outside part, but I feel like the community building and the love and magic happens in those spaces that no matter how old you get, or those are the stories that will last forever.
I saw somebody's Instagram yesterday and they were like, I miss green rooms. And I was like, that is so true. That is what I miss. Like I don't necessarily, I do miss performing, but anyone who knows me knows that performance isn't really it's not the thing that I do the best, but I do miss green rooms, and I do miss interacting with people on the mic, or just that kind of 1-to-1 connections, or 1-to-40 connections, or whatever it is.
I just want to go back. Like, one of the most, like, when you said of missing the green rooms, when I did drag with a bunch of my sisters in Toronto, we were doing it at a bathhouse, and there was one moment where it was a working bathhouse. One of the most famous queens, Carlotta Carlisle, I'm going to shout out to her, looked into a glory hole and a penis poked her in the eye. We'll make a full drag, and she's like, ah, and she had to go on stage 30 seconds later.
Oh yeah, that's the best.
But I feel like I don't remember the rest of the show at all. But that moment for the rest of my life,
that's the moment.
That's the moment. And that like her, me, and two other people shared, and nobody else will. I mean, we're talking about it, but it's that moment that nobody else gets to share, and we get to be like, great, there's something weirdly sisterhoody about it.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
Like, yeah. So one of the other things I wanted to ask you about in your in that article, I'm a mixed white passing urban residing two-spirited Indigenous person. So can we break that down just a little bit? Because I feel like I'm going to assume like mixed white passing means that one of your parents is Indigenous and one of your parents is white.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that, what does that mean navigating in this world? Like,
oh, it means a lot of things. So it means that I have white privilege all the time. Like, for example, when we were younger and we were travel back and forth across the border, they would just like ask me to drive, like ask me to do the check-in and that kind of stuff. Or, when we'd go into a store when we were kids, this is one of my memories I have of being a young child, is like when because I lived off reserve most of my like the vast majority of my life. I lived off reserve, but we did live in public housing in Brandon, which is just 2 hours west of here. And there was like, because it was public housing, it was quite mixed, but there was a overrepresentation of Indigenous people. So we were like, a bunch of us just got on our bikes one day and we were just biking to the store. And they were like, okay, well, Levi, you go in and you steal all the candy bars that we need, because the guy's just going to follow us around. And like, I think I was 10 or 11 years old. Okay. And then that was my first real moment of like, wow, this is like, that's white privilege, right? So then I go in and I just fucking load up my little bag, my little backpack with a bunch of chocolate bars and chips. And I just walk out of the door casually. And then those guys come out 5 minutes later and we just meet at the park, and we just eat a bunch of snacks and then go home. But that's just kind of, that's it in a nutshell, right? But it also, for me, those phrases also signify connection and disconnection in a lot of ways. So because I'm urban residing, I don't have that immediate connection to the territory that my family originated from. Right. And even though we're a migratory people, and I know that, like, I'm familiar with the story of how we ended up in that territory, and at the point of colonization, I'm familiar with that story. I'm still not connected to the land that I'm mostly familiar with, right? That the land that's in my blood. Right. It also means that I didn't have direct access all the time to cultural knowledge that is very specific to the region that I come from. So it means that in a lot of ways that I was always searching for those things, or as a group, when we moved to that area as kind of a large family unit. Prior to my birth, a bunch of my relations moved there, like a couple of my dad and a couple of aunties and a couple of uncles, and and then some cousins, they moved to that region, and that became their home base, and that still is my family's home base out there in a lot of ways. But it also meant that we were constantly searching for people who had that kind of cultural knowledge, because we were in an unfamiliar territory.
Right.
So like my grandma, when she moved out there, she didn't actually speak her language for a long time, because she just automatically assumed every Indigenous person there was Dakota, because it was a very Dakota heavy territory. It wasn't until later that she realized that there was other Anishinaabe people who were living there. So there was that kind of thing. As an urban Indigenous person, you're a little bit disconnected, but you're also really connected to a whole bunch of new things.
Right.
So one of the things that I talk about in the article is like the space at the University of Winnipeg, and that was really, really central for me navigating my identity. My roommate at the time, Jordan, who also became the president of the Aboriginal Student Council, he really encouraged me to like start using that space a lot more. And then I formed friendships and I formed bonds in there, and I learned so much. Again, much of my undergrad experience, I don't remember the classrooms. I can't tell you 80% of the classes that I took in the 4.5 years that I was there, but I can tell you, I can give you specific memories about so many people who utilized that space and who were so central to kind of creating those things. And we were all so mixed. There was, I think at that, like mixed in terms of like cultural backgrounds. So I became friends with a couple of really cool Inuk people. There was lots of Cree people around, and there was some Dene people, there was some Siksika people, there was Dakota people, there's Lakota people, there's Anishinaabe people, there's Métis, and so you had all of these wonderful people who were just converging and bringing all of these things together and forming a community in a space that's literally just a space. It's just a room. It's just a room with some computers. But that was central to me kind of navigating and gravitating towards and learning and really exploring these ideas and kind of relationships and why it's important. Right. So because I'm Indigenous, urban Indigenous person, that also connotates that much of the things that I say are grounded, or much of the things I believe are grounded in a very cosmopolitan view or worldview of indigeneity, of what it means to be Indigenous. And that's not better and that's not worse than somebody who's spent all of their life on the reserve or next to the reserve. Or it's just a very different point of view or perspective of being Indigenous.
And I would imagine very relevant, because it as the community, as people leave the reserve and come out, and if you're migratory people, like you come and go, right? Yeah. As humans, whenever you come and go. So coming in and out of that space, but also is important. So, picking up the culture, bringing it out, but also adapting to as the world changes. Because you're almost recreating new communities and new, I'm going to say community is a great word, as you move forward, because not all our kids and youth will come from the same space, but still require the same, like you still feel connected to a specific land and specific people. And I know for me that I feel like in my early 30s and 20s, that was a big thing for me as well. Where I was like, oh, I'm an Indian who lives in Canada, but grew up in Kenya. And I always thought going back to India would be like, going back to where my great grandfather would be like, I'm going to feel at home. And as soon as I got that, they were like, you don't belong here. And I was like, whoa, what do you mean? Like I waited 30 years to come here to feel like I belong somewhere. But then I realized that as my people immigrated and evolved and went somewhere else, they took what we needed to belong somewhere else for a while. So even though my roots are there, I still belong somewhere else, and my duty as a person is to continue, because there's more of us coming. There's more new people coming into the space. Yeah, and then that's the connection that you want to build. Was that sound familiar for you?
That's really relatable. I think it's also I it's relatable in a lot of ways, and I think it's also crucial because it's important to recognize your roots, but it's also I do feel there's a lot of pressure for us to, I think because Canada as a space, Canada has been defined in a lot of ways. But one of the ways that Canadian identity is solidified and rooted in whiteness. And so it requires me as an Indigenous person to feel that I never, ever, ever, ever fit in Canada's world. And then, but it also requires other people to always feel a longing, like other people of color to feel a longing for a world that maybe they don't necessarily belong to, because Canada is so rooted and Canadian identity is predicated on the isolation of Indigenous peoples and the ostracization of non-Christian, non-white peoples. That is changing in a lot of ways, but it's not necessarily changing as fast as we want it to be. It's not a world that I'm not happy that all my nieces and nephews are going to grow up in this world, but I'm happy that they're not having to grow up in the world that I lived in. Right. You know? So I think that's really key. And I think that's where we can draw some parallels to kind of like our collective experiences, is that we're told constantly that we need to feel connected to these places, and we aren't allowed to create an identity within this larger Canadian national project, right? Right. It has to be rooted somewhere else.
Yeah. Levi, it's so like the moment you said that, my mind went like, it's so, you forget this because like even on a Canadian passport, if you're not born in Canada, it says nationality Canadian, but like it says Canadian citizen, but nationality is somewhere else. Mm-hmm. There's such a, I didn't even think, like, until you said this, I didn't even think about that, but it's such a like, we're allowing you to come into this space, but you still don't belong here. Meanwhile, motherfucker, it wasn't your space to begin with. Like,
well, and on that note, like, it's 2021 and I have a card in my wallet that has my registration number from the day I was born, and my community is a number, my birth is a number, and I'm registered with the Canadian government. And should I ever have a child and meet the requirements for Indian registry, my child in 2021 would be born and would get a status of certificate of Indian registry in 2021.
Oh my God. That's my reaction to it. I can't, like, it's unbelievable. And we have 2 minutes to unpack this shit. I mean, okay.
No, you just walk with it, you just go with it, and then just remember to laugh a little bit later, because the world's immensely fucked up, but sometimes you just gotta laugh about it.
Right. Or scream about it. Like,
or scream about it, yeah.
That's what it'd be fucking like, okay.
That's why I do drag.
Yes. Okay, so there's like I said, I had a list of things that I knew we were gonna get to all of it. So Levi, we'll have to continue this conversation because there's no way we can end it here. I wanted to cover Sunshine House, I wanted to cover Club 200. But most importantly, I wanted to cover, how do you choose love?
How do I choose love?
Yeah.
Love chooses me. I don't go out seeking it. I was very, very fortunate because I was born into such a loving and caring family. Even if because of all of our experiences as a mixed family with a lot of experiences of colonization, the way that we show love is really fucked up a lot to an outsider, but to me, it's love. And so then that's the way that I demonstrate love as well. I'm not gonna go out and hug a crying person, but I am gonna go up to that crying person and I'm gonna be like, what do you need right now? What can I do to make your life a little bit better? I'm not gonna hug you. I'm gonna give you a ride to somebody who might hug you. That's how I show love. but and then I'm really fortunate because in all of the work that I do in Winnipeg, or in all of the work that I've done in my adult life and through that university experience, I've always been welcomed and accepted and shown a lot of really good ways to love. And so like with that cosmopolitan, that really diverse Indigenous experience and collective that I was a part of for 4.5 years, all of those people loved in very different ways, but I was able to take pieces of it and understand it. So there's no one way that I show love. It's relational.
I mean, that's an amazing way to end this. I feel like for the people out there, I'm going to put links for Sunshine House. We're going to put all the information that we want to talk about. And then Levi and I will come back. We have to come back and talk about this because I think the more I follow you and the more I follow Sunshine House, there's just so many great things happening in this community. And it just ties into how much you interweave into the fabric of this community, of the Winnipeg community, and how great the work that's happening here. And for me, because
before we get too emotional, we have to sign out.
But Levi, let's wrap this up. First, I want to say thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I feel like I learned so many pieces. I can't wait to go back and rewatch this and Google names. And to be honest with you, I'm so, I don't have a problem saying this, but I feel like I'm so sheltered and like I'm so urban Toronto that I had 3 Indigenous groups written down here. I'm like, oh, so there's Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, and Cree. And then you mentioned 7 more as we were talking. And I was like, okay, I need to go back and learn, like, so much learning that has to come out of this. And I thank you for that because, you know, I'm a storyteller and I love to learn about people and learn and to share stories. And this is a way for me to get out there and share other people's stories. So thank you for all the learning. Thank you for
You're welcome.
This moment. And thank you for just being in my life right now. Because I think being welcomed into Winnipeg, you were such a big part of it. And even though we haven't physically met,
someday, soon.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lifetime of friendship here that we're going to have to build out. So I'm okay to wait for it because I think the rewards will be so much better. So to wrap up, I'm going to throw one word at you and you throw one word back at me that relates to that for you. Ready?
Okay.
Prairie Sky.
Bitch.
2021.
Hopeful.
Sunshine House.
Love.
Community.
Oh, can I use the same word twice?
Of course you can. You can do whatever you want.
Community. How about we'll go challenging?
Ooh. Bannock Babes.
Magic.
And magic.
Magic is play.
Well, thank you so much for being magical, for being playful, for introducing mind-blowing conversation today. I want to thank people out there for taking time out of their busy day to connect with us as we speak to this iconic community builder. We'll see you bitches next week.